Hi guys, I know you all probably know about this new study about D-lactic acidosis, probiotics, brain fog, and SIBO, so I wanted to do a special video just for this. I actually decided I think I'm going to make this a two-part series. The first one is we're going to go over this particular study that has everybody losing their damn minds. And then in another video, I think I'm going to talk a little bit more about what is D-lactic acidosis, how big of an issue it is, how to test for it, etc. There's really not any testing that I'm aware of right now that will test for this, but I'm going to look into it because supposedly Mayo will do it. I just don't know if it's going to cost an arm and leg. But let's get into this study and figure out how much do we need to freak out. Short answer, not a lot. Listen, so here's my my brief thoughts. I have read this study at least 5 times in the last week or two since it's come out. It just came out, let's see, I mean, in the last like 2 weeks, maybe. So here's a couple of things, because they tried really, really hard to make this a good study, but there's some really fundamental flaws that make me kind of go, eh, and not really stress about the D-lactate thing for a number of reasons. So right off the get-go, I'm going to point out, when you're critiquing research articles, one of the things that you can look at to assess quality is how big of a group did they look at. Now, this isn't perfect. It's not to say that n equals 1, you know, an article about one person might not have value. But when you're trying to make broad sweeps like this article has got people doing, when you're trying to make broad sweeps about an article like this, and about big groups of people, like everybody with SIBO, then it's important to look at how many people they assessed. So right off the get-go, the study only assessed 38 people. 38. And the 2 cohorts were not even equal. There was 30 people enrolled in the study who had brain fog, as they abbreviate it, BF. And then they had 8 people in the study who had similar gut symptoms, but they had no brain fog. So that is how they chose to break up this study. They looked at people with brain fog and people without, and then they analyzed the data from there. So that is one of the areas where the study really doesn't hold a ton of weight, in my opinion, is that we're only looking at 38 people, and we can't really say that this is going to apply to all SIBO patients across the board. Furthermore, here's where they really made a solid effort, and much to his credit also, the principal investigator, the lead scientist on this, Dr. Rayo, I've been emailing him, and he's actually been very helpful and responsive with email. I feel bad for him. I think he's gotten really bombarded with the amount of inquiries from this article. I don't know if they were fully anticipating that. Anyhow, so they really, really tried to make this a good study. They said somewhere here, I think on page 2, that all of the patients in both groups filled out a questionnaire. They were all worked up. Here it is. Additionally, only subjects with normal upper endoscopy and duodenal biopsy, normal colonoscopy and biopsy, normal abdominal CT imaging, and normal hematological and biochemical profiles were enrolled. Patients with a history of small bowel or colonic surgery, those with known intestinal dysmotility, parentheses, scleroderma or pseudoobstruction, and those with a history of recent antibiotic use, parentheses, in the previous 6 weeks, or a history of neurologic or neuropsychiatric problems, or celiac disease, or Helicobacter pylori infection, or renal or liver failure were excluded from the study. So they made, like, above and beyond an amazing amount of effort. They ruled out pretty much everything else but SIBO prior to enrolling in this study, if you think about it. Normal endoscopy, normal colonoscopy, like they looked in both ends, liver failure, renal failure, celiac disease, neuropsychiatric disorders, like they ruled out everything minus SIBO, basically, before enrolling people in the study. And if people had one of those conditions, they were excluded from the study. So that is just beautiful. Like I like wept on the inside when I saw that, because I thought that was really well done. And I can't imagine the amount of money that went into doing an endoscopy, colonoscopy, biopsies, CT scan, chemistries, all of this testing on every single one of these patients. And that might be part of why the study group was pretty small, because they probably had to pay an arm and a leg to get all this testing done. So anyhow, So people who had all of that ruled out were then enrolled in the study. And what they say here, the conclusion of the study, if you look at the abstract, we describe a syndrome of brain fog, gas and bloating, possibly related to probiotic use, SIBO, and D-lactic acidosis in a cohort with short bowel. Patients with brain fog exhibited higher prevalence of SIBO and D-lactic acidosis. Symptoms improved with antibiotics and stopping probiotics. Clinicians should recognize and treat this condition. That sounds pretty profound. So now I'm going to go through and I'm going to show you some of the issues with the actual study. And I made a lot of notes, but let's see. So one of the nice things about the study and why I was able to pick it apart is because they actually gave us information about each individual patient. Now, it's not perfect. Like, they could have included a little bit more perhaps, but they tell you the patient's age, their sex, whether or not they're on proton pump inhibitors, a lot of them were, whether or not they're on opioids, a fair amount of them were, whether or not they tested for D-lactate, they gave the levels for that, and whether or not they tested for SIBO. And they tested two ways. They did a glucose breath test, which generally is going to catch SIBO that's pretty high up, higher up towards the stomach, not necessarily the overgrowths that are at the distal end of the small intestine. And then they did a duodenal aspirate, where they sampled fluid from the highest up part of the small intestine. Now, one of the big points, I'm sorry, I'm going to toggle between notes I have on the screen and notes I have here. One of the things is right in the discussion and the conclusions on the last page, the authors right there say two things: whether or not the brain fog group had SIBO prior to probiotics is unclear. So translation, these people could have had SIBO first, highly likely, started taking probiotics because, you know, it's a treatment for gut stuff. Like, everybody has tried a probiotic, I guarantee it. So, like everybody on this channel, certainly. So people have gut problems, they feel like crap, they get a probiotic. Like, everybody's seen the Jamie Lee Curtis commercials, and you know, we learned about yogurt and how good it is for us. So everybody got on a probiotic practically, and then guess what? It didn't work, and they still had SIBO, and then they wound up in this study. So biggest issue I think I have with the whole study actually is that it's not clear whether or not people had SIBO first before taking the probiotics, and if just the SIBO caused the D-lactate level that was high. So that's one thing. Oh, and I should step back. I'm sorry, this is kind of a ping-pongy video. D-lactate is kind of like lactic acid. So like when you work your muscles really hard and you make lactic acid, it's the same thing, but if you remember back to organic chemistry, which I know all of us loved so much, it's kind of like looking at your hands. Like, yeah, they're the same, but they're mirror images of each other. Like, you can't just put one on top of the other. They're mirror images. That's what the D-lactate is. So if one form is lactic acid that's produced by your muscles, D-lactate is the mirror image of that. The body has a harder time excreting that and has a harder time dealing with that. But various bacteria and some yeast can make that stuff, and it's harder for our bodies to get rid of. And it's been implicated in recent years with chronic fatigue and mitochondrial impairment. So I guess I should have said that right in the beginning. Anyway, so that was number one, is whether or not people had SIBO first, and the SIBO caused the brain fog and the high D-lactate levels. That was not clear. That was not determined here. Like, that's kind of a big deal before you make broad sweeps about a group, but they do mention that. They also mentioned that they only cultured fluid from the distal small bowel, or I'm sorry, also we did not culture fluid from the distal far small bowel where most of the colonization may have occurred. So translation, if you have SIBO that's further down in your system, in the ileum or the jejunum, they did not have a way to detect that. Glucose breath tests only really catch SIBO that's really high up, really overgrown, closer to the stomach. And likewise, the duodenal aspirate that they did caught some additional patients that the glucose test missed, but it's still only going to catch so many patients with SIBO. If you have SIBO and it's down like closer to the ileocecal valve or in the tail end of the ileum, the last part of the small intestine, you could have a very real SIBO infection and not know it based on these tests. So I hypothesize probably an awful lot of their cohort, if not every single person, probably had SIBO, honestly. They all had the symptoms. It certainly seemed like it at least. But testing is flawed. I talked about this before. Relying on any SIBO test, it's flawed. You're almost better off going off of symptoms a lot of the time. And I know people are going to rag me for that in the comments, but I'll talk to you about that later. So anyway, those were the two big limitations, is they only cultured fluid from the most proximal part of the small intestine, and they didn't establish a timeline relationship, whether, which came first, the chicken or the egg. Now I'm going to read some of my notes that there was other things that I found wrong with the study, or things that were left something to be desired, so to say. So when I went through, I caught a couple of what I believe to be errors, and I've been going back and forth with the PI on this, and he's confirmed a couple of things that I was correct on. If you just read the study and you just read, the actual text, and you don't look at the data from the charts they provided, you could easily miss this, and again, kind of make mountains out of molehills. So here's one of those. On page 5, if you want to follow along, under breath test, the patient's typical brain fog symptoms experienced at home was reproduced during the breath test in 20 out of 30, and all of them had evidence of SIBO either with the breath test or the culture. That's actually not true. If you go back to their tables, it says these patients had brain fog while doing the breath test, but had no evidence of SIBO in the tests. Now, again, these people could have had SIBO. Just because they have 2 negative tests does not mean they're off the hook for SIBO. But according to their own data, which I'm assuming they're going off of, patients 1, 3, 7, 9, 12, 16, 18, and 21 all had brain fog reproduced on doing the test, but they did not have evidence of SIBO according to their tests. So that's something that they just blatantly, that's just false. They put a falsehood in the text of the study. Then another one, page 6, last sentence in the last column under testing summary. Based on either positive glucose breath test or duodenal aspirate / culture, 19 patients, 63.3% patients, were diagnosed with SIBO, and all of them had D-lactic acidosis. Again, this is not true. When I looked at their own table in the study, the following patients tested positive for SIBO but did not have D-lactic acidosis. Patients 2, 5, 6, 10, 20, and 29. Those people had SIBO but did not have D-lactate levels that were high, according to their numbers and according to their charts. Why they said that, I don't know. Some grad student typing shit, not paying attention. One more kind of falsehood that I just want to bring up. And by the way, I'm going to link a blog post that I've written on this outlining more of these issues. And I'm going to, if you want to look more into my really nitpicking through this, you can read it. But here's one more. Page 7, very top of the page on the right-hand side, the right column. The use of prolonged or excessive probiotics and or cultured yogurt further contributed to the small intestinal colonization by lactobacilli and other bacteria. They don't provide a reference for this, so I'm assuming that they're going off of their study when they say that. I think that is really overstepping their bounds. They did not show definitively that it was the yogurt or excessive use. They didn't even determine what excessive use of probiotics was. Were these people taking 15 pills a day? I don't know. I'm assuming they're taking a reasonable dose. But they don't define what excessive use of probiotics is first and foremost, and they did not correlate it. According to their studies, they did not have a clear cause and effect correlation. They associated the people who had brain fog happened to be the people who took probiotics. Whether or not that's causal, we really don't know. But that, if they're using their own data and their own study to make that assumption, and they're not citing it from another study, so I'm assuming that's what they're going for, then I think that is horribly overstepping their bounds, and they don't provide data to substantiate that. They just don't. Okay, but now let's get into some other points, the bigger actual point. So now that I've nitpicked and brought up some errors, some of the things that I took away from this study was this, and this might be the most important part. So if you've hung in with me this long, more power to you. They mentioned the 23 patients in the brain fog group were treated with antibiotics and asked to discontinue probiotics. The remaining 7 people were asked to discontinue the probiotic or yogurt and given individual dietary advice. When I asked the principal investigator, Dr. Rayo, he said dietary advice included eliminating fructose, lactose, fructans. It depended on the person, but there was further investigation, and if people were determined to be, intolerant to lactose, then they were put on that diet. But if you go back to that main number, 23 patients in the brain fog group makes up 76.67, repeating whatever, percent of the brain fog group. So 76% of them got an antibiotic, right? And also discontinued their probiotic. After treatment, their words, they said, after treatment, 70% of people reported significant improvement in gut symptoms. Duh. I mean, if you have SIBO and you get an antibiotic, do you not feel better? If you have an infection and you treat the infection, do you not feel better? Yeah, totally. After treatment, 85% reported a complete resolution of their brain fog. Again, 76% of the people were given an antibiotic. So right off the get-go, I have really high hopes that people are going to feel stupendous. But also, that extra 10 or so percent, 9%, between the people who were treated with an antibiotic and the other people, well, if you were lactose intolerant and you were told to avoid lactose, wouldn't you feel pretty stupendous? Yes. Would that have anything to do necessarily with the D-Lactate level in the yogurt, or is it just that you can't tolerate yogurt? Right? So of course the majority of people felt better after their issues were treated. They were either given a diet specific to what was going on with them, which is just great, or they were giving an antibiotic to treat their damn SIBO. So of course they felt better, and of course their brain fog went away. It might have nothing to do with the probiotic. And this is the whole point of this video, and God only knows how long I've been talking now. The whole thing, my issue with it, one of them, is that they didn't parse out the bits of the study to a point where we could say definitively yes or no to the probiotic thing. If they had said, if they had done the exact same study and they had patients do 1 month only discontinuing the probiotic, and they watched, and then after a month of just doing that, did another symptom survey to see how many people think the brain fog improved or did not improve. If they did it in phases where they said that, only work on the probiotic variable for X amount of time, and then treat the SIBO, and then give the dietary advice or whatever it might have been. But if they had parsed out the 2 bits, if they're really trying to go after the probiotics and they're really trying to determine if probiotics are the cause of the D-Lactate level and of the brain fog, then there's 2 big things they could have done. Number 1, what I just said, is parse out the individual pieces to the puzzle one at a time and do science. That's the summary of that. So if they had people eliminate the probiotics for a month or 2, those people came back in and they said, wow, my brain fog is better. Okay, now we're on to something. If those same people came back in and said, no, my brain fog and my gut symptoms are the same, okay, well, maybe it's not the probiotic. And then you do the antibiotics. Similarly, they could have done it reverse. They could have said, okay, SIBO patients, we're going to give you an antibiotic first, and maybe dietary advice, both. Like, let's do both right out the get-go, reassess, and then afterwards have them do a separate trial with that variable and say, okay, now we've gotten you X amount of the way there. Now cut out your probiotic and reassess. Like, if they had just done it in 2 phases, then we could have correlated stuff with the probiotic. But right now, I'm still saying, I think it's just that they treated the SIBO and treated some of the intolerances, and that's probably the bulk of what made people feel better. The other thing that really drove me a little bonkers when I was reading this, because again, they tried so hard. It's a really beautiful study. All of the prep that went into it, the testing, it's actually a beautiful study. But they missed a couple of really big things. Why didn't they retest? They didn't retest for SIBO after the fact, which, I mean, I could live with that because I'm not huge on SIBO testing anyway. Like, I can live with that. But why didn't they at least retest for the D-Lactate level? That would have been so profound if they had taken the group, the 85% who said they reported complete resolution of their brain fog. 85%. Take that 85% of the brain fog group, have them redo the lactate test, redo the SIBO test, because that's how they provoked it, have them redo the 2 tests, which are pretty easy to do, redo those, and assess, do you still have D-lactic acidosis? Take the other cohort, the people who said they still have brain fog, do the same thing. Retest and assess. Do you have D-lactic acidosis or do you not? That piece of data, if they just retested and compared the people who got rid of their brain fog and the people who did not, that would have been also just huge. And that would have been so helpful to know. But no, we didn't assess that. And likewise, we could have done that. They could have done that at 2 steps of the journey. They could have treated the SIBO, done the antibiotic, done the dietary advice, retested for D-lactate and SIBO, reassessed, and then had them take out the probiotics and then reassess. Like, that would have made this just like an amazing study. It's a good study. I'm not going to give it amazing just for those reasons, because that added information would have been so valuable. But instead, we're left to guess and we're left to speculate. And, you know, we're looking at this too. Brain fogginess, gas, and bloating, a link between SIBO probiotics and metabolic acidosis. I don't know. Is there a link with the probiotic piece? I don't know. I think even the title of the article might be overstepping just a little bit. So I guess in summary, there's more that I'll link to the blog below, but I don't want to babble for too long. In summary, they really, really tried hard to make this a beautiful study, but they didn't take into account handling the individual variables, and they didn't retest to a point where we can't really say, is it just that you feel better and you're no longer producing D-lactate because you had an infection and it was treated, like you had SIBO and it was treated? Or was there something more to it? I don't know. But here's the thing too, and it's linked in that article I'm going to link, is that there has been numerous studies on probiotics and SIBO. And the overarching theme is that it works. It can help treat SIBO, it can reduce hydrogen levels, it can reduce symptomology. And from personal experience, I use probiotics with a lot of my SIBO patients, and it works really, really well. Do I do it on day 1? No, but I do usually mix that into the treatment plan at some point within the first couple of months. So here's the thing, like, do we throw the baby out with the bathwater? Do we say, you know, oh, I know we have all of this other data that says probiotics are good for human health, good for various diseases, including SIBO and IBS, including large meta-analyses for IBS and SIBO. Do we throw that all out and panic over the D-lactic thing? Or do we take it with a grain of salt and move forward and maybe just go, hey, they made a solid effort, but they didn't conclude anything necessarily. What I would say is the latter, but what I would say is, what did we learn from this is a couple things. Brain fog is common in SIBO patients. Like, that was demonstrated if you just look at the data that they supplied. Brain fog is very common with SIBO patients. D-lactic acidosis is also common with SIBO patients. That's another thing that's useful to know. Again, whether or not it's coming from the SIBO itself or the probiotic. I think we can also take away that a lot of people with gut issues take probiotics, particularly people who have brain fog and like cognitive issues with their gut issues. A lot of them take probiotics. You can take that away. I also noted in that blog that testing for SIBO is imperfect. Both of the testing methods missed some people with SIBO, so testing is imperfect. We know that. And the biggest takeaway from this whole study, I think, is treating SIBO makes SIBO patients feel better.